Well, it's 8 o'clock, 8:01 on a Sunday night, and it's time for Shelter-in-Place Storytime. Once again, I'm your host, Paul Klemperer. I don't know who is out there, but I'm making this a regular broadcast every Sunday. And here we go. It's been a big, busy week, and I should just say I'm a little bit tired because I was checked out the demonstration downtown today. I know people were aware in Austin, like other cities across the country, there are a lot of demonstrators, marchers, protesters against violence against black folks and the recent upsurge, continual, the status quo, as it were. And so I'm not going to get into the details, but I thought I would read a few things that are part of our history and I think kind of connected to it all. And so it's a little different tonight. I'm trying to process it all, and my agenda always with Shelter-in-Place Storytime is to provide something to help as we are all getting through this COVID-19 period and trying to do it responsibly and stay in our domiciles as much as we can, and when we go out to try to be responsible and thoughtful towards each other. As they say, the idea is to assume that you're a carrier and you don't want to infect others. So you want to have an infectious smile, an infectious good spirit, a heart that is going to infect others with love. But as far as all the particles and the moisture with the virus and all that coming out of you, you're trying not to do that. So anyway, that's been my goal with this Shelter-in-Place Storytime every Sunday, to make life, whatever, a little bit more fluid. Anyway, I'm going to read a few things, and so like I'm saying, I guess my point is this might be a little bit heavy, but I'm going to just try to read some interesting historical stuff. And I've been wanting to read some Zora Neale Hurston for a while. I've got these books of hers in the Library of America, and it's she's got a lot to read, but to try to think of something that would be good to read out loud, and I just found this little essay rather than one of her stories. It's a little essay, and just to couch it in the proper historical context, she wrote this in December of 1945 for Negro Digest. And so the term Negro, of course, was in the 40s, that was the current term. So I'm just going to read what she wrote. And here we go. Welcome, everybody. Glenn, Ruben, thanks for being here. And yeah, I guess I could frame it more, but I'm just going to read it and see what comes up. This is called Crazy for This Democracy. They tell me this democracy form of government is a wonderful thing. It has freedom, equality, justice, in short, everything. Since 1937, nobody has talked about anything else. The late Franklin D. Roosevelt sort of redecorated it and called these United States the boastful name of the arsenal of democracy. The radio, the newspapers, and the columnists inside the newspapers have said how lovely it was. All this talk and praise giving has got me in the notion to try some of the stuff. All I want to do is to get hold of a sample of the thing, and I declare I sure will try it. I don't know for myself, but I have been told that it is really wonderful. Like the late Will Rogers, all I know is what I see by the papers. It seems like now I do not know geography as well as I ought to, or I would not get the wrong idea about so many things. I heard so much about global world freedom and things like that I must have gotten mixed up about oceans. I thought that when they said Atlantic Charter, that meant me and everybody in Africa and Asia and everywhere. But it seems like the Atlantic is an ocean that does not touch anywhere but North America and Europe. Just the other day, seeing how things were going in Asia, I went out and bought myself an atlas and found out how narrow this Atlantic Ocean was. No wonder that those 4 freedoms couldn't get no further than they did. Why, that poor little ocean can't even wash up some things right here in America, let alone places like India, Burma, Indochina, and the Netherlands, East Indies. We need 2 more whole oceans for that. Maybe I need to go out and buy me a dictionary too, or perhaps a spelling book would help me out a lot. Or it could be that I just mistook the words. Maybe I mistook a British pronunciation for a plain American word. Did FDR, aristocrat from Groton and Harvard, using the British language, say arse and all of democracy when I thought he said plain arsenal? Maybe he did, and I have been mistaken all this time. From what is going on, I think that is what he must have said. That must be what he said, for from what is happening over on that other unmentioned ocean, we look like the ass and all of democracy. Our weapons, money, and the blood of millions of our men have been used to carry the English, French, and Dutch, and lead them back on the millions of unwilling Asiatics. The ass and all he has been very useful. The Indo-Chinese are fighting the French now in Indochina to keep the freedom that they have enjoyed for 5 or 6 years now. The Indonesians are trying to stay free from the Dutch, and the Burmese and Malayans from the British. But American soldiers and sailors are fighting along with the French, Dutch, and English to rivet these chains back on their former slaves. How can we so admire the fire and determination of Toussaint Louverture to resist the orders of Napoleon to rip the gold braids off those Haitian slaves and put them back to work after 4 years of freedom, and be indifferent to these Asiatics for the same feelings under the same circumstances? Have we not noted that not one word has been uttered about the freedom of the Africans? On the contrary, there have been mutterings in undertones about being fair and giving different nations sources of raw materials there. The ass and all of democracy has shouldered the load of subjugating the dark world completely. The only Asiatic power able to offer any effective resistance has been double-teamed by the combined powers of the Occident and rendered incapable of offering or encouraging resistance, and likewise removed as an example to the dark people of the world. Just for anybody that might have jumped in, hello Isolde, Mel, I'm reading Zora Neale Hurston article from 1945, and I'm not going to explain it anymore, I think, but she's kind of like saying it. The inference is that God has restated the superiority of the West. God always does like that when 1,000 white people surround one dark one. Dark people are always bad when they do not admit the divine plan like that. A certain Javanese man who sticks up for Indonesian independence is very low down by the papers and suspected of being a Japanese puppet. Wanting the Dutch to go back to Holland and go to work for themselves? The very idea. A very, very bad man, that Japanese. As for me, I am just as skeptical as this contrary Javanese. I accept this idea of democracy. I am all for trying it out. It must be a good thing if everybody praises it like that. If our government has been willing to go to war and to sacrifice billions of dollars and millions of men for the idea, I think that I ought to give the thing a trial. The only thing that keeps me from pitching the headlong into the thing is the presence of numerous Jim Crow laws on the statute books of the nation. I am crazy about the idea of this democracy. I want to see how it feels. Therefore, I am all for the repeal of every Jim Crow law in the nation here and now, not in another generation or so. The Hurstons have already been waiting 80 years for that. I want it here and now. And why not? A lot of people in these United States have been saying all this time that things ought to be equal. Numerous instances of inequality have been pointed out and fought over in the courts and in the newspapers. That seems like a waste of time to me. The patient has the smallpox. Segregation and things like that are the bumps and blisters on the skin, and not the disease, but evidence and symptoms of the sickness. The doctors around the bedside of the patient are desperately picking bumps. Nice image. Some assume that the opening of one blister will cure the case. Some strangely assert that a change of climate is all that is needed to kill the virus in the blood. I hope this is all right. Welcome, Bridget. The metaphor being that the patient has smallpox and the doctors are trying to cure the little blisters one at a time. But why this sentimental oversimplification in diagnosis? Do the doctors not know anything about the widespread occurrence of this disease? It is not peculiar to the South. Canada, once the refuge of escaping slaves, has now its denomination of second-class citizens, and they are the Japanese and other non-Caucasians. The war cannot explain it because enemy Germans are not put in that second class. That's worth saying again. This is written in 1945. Canada, once the refuge of escaping slaves, has now its denomination of second-class citizens, and they are the Japanese and other non-Caucasians. The war cannot explain it because enemy Germans are not put in that second class. Jim Crow is the rule in South Africa and is even more extensive than in America, more rigid and grinding. No East Indian may ride first class in the trains of British-held India. Jim Crow is common in all colonial Africa, Asia, and the Netherlands, East Indies. There, too, a Javanese male is punished for flirting back at a white female. So why this stupid assumption that moving north will do away with social smallpox? Events in the northern cities do not bear out this juvenile contention. So why the waste of good time and energy, and further delay the recovery of the patient by picking him over bump by bump and blister by blister? Why not the shot of serum that will kill the thing in the blood? The bumps are symptoms. The symptoms cannot disappear until the cause is cured. These Jim Crow laws have been put on the books for a purpose, and that purpose is psychological. It has two edges to the thing. By physical evidence, back seats in trains, back doors of houses, exclusion from certain places and activities, to promote in the mind of the smallest white child the conviction of first by birth, external and irrevocable, like the place assigned to the Levites by Moses over the other tribes of the Hebrews. Talent, capabilities, nothing has anything to do with the case, just first by birth. No one of darker skin can ever be considered an equal. Seeing the daily humiliations of the darker people confirm the child in its superiority, so that it comes to feel it the arrangement of God. By the same means, the smallest dark child is to be convinced of its inferiority, so that it is to be convinced that competition is out of the question and against all nature and God. All physical and emotional things flow from this premise. It perpetuates itself. The unnatural exaltation of one ego and the equally unnatural grinding down of the other. The business of some whites to help pick a bump or so is even part of the pattern. That's a good line. The business of some whites to help pick a bump or so is even part of the pattern. Not a human right, but a concession from the throne has been made. Otherwise, why do they not take the attitude of Robert Ingersoll that all of it is wrong? Why the necessity for the little concession? Why not go for the underskin injection? It is a bargaining with a detail to save... Is it a bargaining with a detail to save the whole intact? Let me read that one more time. Why the necessity for the little concession? Why not go for the underskin injection? Is it a bargaining with a detail to save the whole intact? It is something to think about. As for me, I am committed to the hypodermic and the serum. I see no point in the picking of a bump. Others can erupt too easily. That same one can burst out again. Witness the easy scrapping of FEPC. No, I give my hand, my heart, and my head to the total struggle. I am for complete repeal of all Jim Crow laws in the United States once and for all, and right now, for the benefit of this nation and as a precedent to the world. I have been made to believe in this democracy thing, and I am all for tasting this democracy out. The flavor must be good. If the Occident is so intent in keeping the taste out of darker mouths that it spends all those billions and expends all those millions of lives, colored ones too, to keep it among themselves, then it must be something good. I crave to sample this gorgeous thing, so I cannot say anything different from repeal of all Jim Crow laws, not in some future generation, but repeal now and forever. Zora Neale Hurston in the Negro Digest, December 1945. That's a pretty good one. Picking at a bump. That's a good image. How's everybody doing out there? Welcome. Shelter-in-place story time. It's been a tough week out there, and I got my taste of, Austin, the demonstrations. I went down there today to see what was going on, and it was quite real. A lot of people, and reminded me we're in Texas, and Texas is part of the world, and stuff's going on. And even though we're in the midst of this virus situation in which we are encouraged in a way to detach and separate and be in our own little bubbles, that it's very strange psychologically, because you're the big emotional challenge right now is this feeling of separation and isolation, and you want to be part of a community, but you want to be responsible, so you don't want to be a carrier, a vector, spreading your your corona bubbles wherever you go. And on the other hand, there's this very urgent need to feel connected and be connected, and to not just be watching from the outskirts. But so it's quite confusing. If anybody has any insights, I'd love to hear them. Oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to lighten the mood for just a minute. So that was an essay by Zora Neale Hurston from 1945. I got this idea for a poem. It's really a work in progress, and I wrote it, but I'm just gonna throw it out there. And if anybody wants to take the image and add to it or write their own version, I think it was sort of out of a dream. I think I was half asleep, though. I'm pretty much half asleep all the time these days. The border between awake and asleep is very fuzzy. That I had this image of Joe Biden as a bus driver on a Greyhound bus, you know, with his aviator sunglasses, and he's, you know, I'm in charge, you know, get on the bus, I'm in charge. And so it was kind of a dream image. I might have dreamed it, or maybe I just kind of thought as I was waking up. But I thought, that might be a poem, so I'm experimenting. So here's a little poem. It's called Eyes on the Road, Joe. As travelers, we liked to be in control. Everyone has their dreams, their plans, and it is hard-won wisdom that if you want to get where you're going, it is best to rely on yourself. But there are times when you have to compromise, when you have to take a road you didn't want to go as part of your larger journey. So you keep your eyes on the road. As travelers, we were on a bus with many others from many places, with many hopes and dreams, and driving the bus, we saw, was Joe Biden. Joe liked to smile while he drove, his hands roaming all around the steering wheel, and he liked to look over his shoulder and make little quips, little asides, drawing from his vast reservoir of personal memories. Those near the front smiled politely, but someone in the back of the bus yelled, "Keep your eyes on the road, Joe." And the travelers around me took a breath and muttered, their voices growing in strength, "Keep your eyes on the road, Joe. Keep your eyes on the road. There's such a very long way to go, so keep your eyes on the road." Anyway, a little poem. Hope you enjoyed it. Well, how's everybody doing? Please drop a comment in the chat window if you have something. This is one of the few broadcasts I do where I can actually see the screen and respond. And if somebody has any pearls of wisdom they'd like to share. It's shelter in place story time. Sips. I'm having a sip. I want to give a shout out to Mr. D.B. Martin, my good friend, piano player, songwriter. He gave me this coffee mug with a saxophone on it. It's one of my favorites. It makes me feel optimistic. All right. Well, I'm going to read one more thing tonight. And, Mary says she liked the poem. Post it online. I will. I'll write it up. Maybe I'll even edit it and make it better. Take out some of the ands, ers, and buts. This is from a book. I used to be an academic back when I was younger and thought I was going to have a career and, be a professor. And in my mind, I'm a professor, and I guess that's the important thing, that I feel like a professor. Anyway, I would collect all these books. I used to haunt half-price books and find all kinds of interesting things. So this is a book of articles. This is all backwards, but Valerie Wilmer, As Serious as Your Life, The Story of the New Jazz, written, wow. She was born in England in 1941 and blah, blah, blah. You can read her biography online, I'm sure. This was published in Britain in 1977 and then in the U.S. in 1980. So it's old, but it's got some good stuff. And just a little bit of a backstory that back in the 60s and early 70s, there was a radical movement, if you want to put a name on it. Don't sweat the petty things Pet the Sweaty Things, Don Walzer. Nice one. Thanks, Peter. Anyway, everybody, has seen all the time-life processing of our cultural history. We see, the anti-Vietnam and, Martin Luther King and all the, the civil rights and anti-war marchers and all that. But to think of it as a cultural movement, I don't know if these words are just labels, but an energy that expressed itself in different places, different times, but during this period of the 60s and early 70s when I was growing up. And so something would bubble up and people would go, well, what the hell? And it would sort of pop up in a situation or context that was surprising. But the ideas weren't that surprising, and they just got expressed in different forms, which I think maybe is something to bear in mind when you're trying to go about your daily life and something strange happens and you go, what the heck? But you realize it's part of an expression of an energy that's all around us and coming up and bubbling up like Zora Neale Hurston's little bumps and blisters of the smallpox of society. I don't want to get too graphic, but so that's all to introduce this essay, this article, because in the 60s, the musicians that worked in Los Angeles and different places that produced television shows, and they were like the live musicians that would play in the orchestras and the music for the TV and movies and all that. And politics was making its way and consciousness was making its way through these musicians, and they were finding ways to express it. So there'd be like protests or actions to express that. And so this happened in various TV shows. I think Merv Griffin, Dick Cavett, some of the other talk shows, there'd be like stuff that would happen on live TV. Musicians would protest or do something. And so check your history. It happened. I'm not just dreaming it. So anyway, this is an article, and let's see if I can find the actual date it was published. That might give it a little more context. Bear with me. This was Downbeat magazine, 1970, and I'm sorry, these are some of the notes. Some of the quotes were from Downbeat 1970, and some of them are from various Melody Maker and Coda magazine, 1970 through 1973. So imagine, if you will, the early 1970s. Politics, the Media, and Collectivism by Valerie Wilmer. A quote from Hakim Jami. It gets to be a drag when they're talking about that Iron Curtain that used to be around Russia. Shit, they moved that here and put it in front of the jazz musician. Hakim Jami. On 13 October 1970, one of Dick Cavett's guests on his ABC TV chat show was Trevor Howard. Cavett, who boasts an audience of several millions, asked the British actor, "What is it about New York that has changed?" Howard's answer, that there was no longer anywhere to go to hear jazz, was the signal for over 200 members of the audience to stand up and start blowing furiously on wooden whistles and police whistles. The reply had been pure coincidence. This onslaught was the third in a series of demonstrations organized by the Jazz and People's Movement to draw attention to the way American television has ignored the music. The J&PM first went into action 2 months prior to the Cavett demonstration, when 60 people, led by Rahsaan Roland Kirk, interrupted CBS TV's Merv Griffin show in the same way. They had gained admission, quite legitimately, by ticket, and took everyone by surprise. Although the house band tried to drown out the invaders on both occasions, they were no match for Kirk and the powerful lungs of the J&PM. The taping was stopped as petitions were passed out and signs displayed bearing slogans such as, "Stop the whitewash now, hire more black artists on TV," and "End pollution of the eye and ear. We demand the termination of television's frozen music today." The musicians taking part included the saxophonist Billy Harper, drummers Andrew Cyril and Ron Jefferson, and the late Lee Morgan, the trumpeter. Between them, they engaged network executives in discussion and explained the reasons for their protest to hastily assembled journalists and the outraged studio audience. The immediate result of the pressure was a promise that jazz artists would be considered for the show. It was Lee Morgan talking to a reporter who summarized the demonstrators' creed. The airways belong to the public, and we're here to dramatize that fact. Jazz is the only real American music, but how often do you see jazz musicians in front of the camera? And we're not talking about jazz musicians playing in the house band. A token handful worked in television, among them the trumpeters Clark Terry and Snooky Young. 5 weeks later, the J&PM struck again, led by Rahsaan Roland Kirk. This time their target was NBC's Johnny Carson show, where they blocked the doors and only allowed the taping to continue after a series of discussions between them and the network were promised. It was the attack on Cavett, however, that produced the most immediate results from the demands of the group, whose stipulated goals included more jazz and black musicians on television and other media, regular programming of shows that would educate the public about black music, more black musicians on daily and weekly network television, and more recognition of jazz musicians when they do appear as guests on television. The musicians secured a half-hour discussion, and the following week, Cecil Taylor, Freddie Hubbard, Harper, Cyril, and Kirk's wife Edith appeared with Cavett and aired their grievances. Cyril later said, "The general feeling I get from most of the people who coordinate these programs is that anything that is called art is kind of subjective and personal in its appeal and may not be tasteful enough where the general public is concerned. They don't want to have the music on many times because they don't want their ratings to go down." In spite of this, the discussion represented a triumph for the J&PM, who had been provoked into taking direct action only after repeated attempts by individual artists to secure bookings on television. Another outcome was a televised dialogue of the drums between the three percussionists Cyril, Milford Graves, and Rashid Ali on NBC's Positively Black. The appearances arising from the demonstration culminated in an all-star group selected by Kirk playing on The Ed Sullivan Show. The doyen of the television personality cult, who only surrendered because he did not want his own show interrupted, provided history with an unforgettable quote. Asked by Kirk why he'd never had John Coltrane on the program, the late lamented arbiter of public taste replied, "Does John Coltrane have any records out?" That's Ed Sullivan Show. Just going to pause for a cause here. Take a sip. Shelter-in-place story time. Welcome, Barbara, Marshall. I'm reading an article by Valerie Wilmer about, well, you get the gist of it. And this was written in the early 70s. The move towards collective action started long before the inception of the jazz and people's movement with the AACM, founded in Chicago in 1965. The Jazz Composers Guild had been more of an elitist effort, but Collective Black Artists, another New York-based group, is a self-reliance program headed by the businesslike Reggie Workman, formerly a bassist in the Coltrane Quartet, and includes musicians involved in the new music as well as established artists like Rahsaan Roland Kirk. At one time, CBA published their own newspaper, Expansions. These acronyms, AACM and CBA, I could get into it, but go ahead and just Google it. Google it. You'll enjoy it. All these groups grew out of an awareness that unless musicians attempted to control their own destinies, the music was doomed to an ever-diminishing audience in the face of economic pressures from the huge conglomerates that control the music industry. The gap between the philosophies of musicians of different ages is not always easily closed. though there is more unity between the disparate groups than outsiders generally imagine. There were gaps before, and there still are, really, in the different styles of music, said Billy Harper. You could hardly get an older musician to respect the style that a younger musician might want to play, because the older musician knows more about music. Well, he's more experienced, but he doesn't necessarily know more about music. He's not so likely to trust what a younger musician is doing. Harper's commitment to the concept of collective musicianship is strong, because he feels it is the only way musicians will be able to change their situation. Mainly black musicians, that is, because they are the ones that really starve, unquote. There must be a collective effort, he says, to raise the level of the music and improve its tarnished image. Quote, it's still a fact that so many musicians die early, and that's terrible. The lifestyle itself, I suppose, would have something to do with that. If a musician gets so depressed that he can't express his music or can't get it out to be heard, then I suppose some of the older musicians, with the economic pressures that were there and that still are there, resorted to drugs sometimes, some to drink, and some were discouraged completely about trying to be into that thing, the groove of musicians who work and are noticed, unquote. Although he admitted that apart from appreciating its historical value, younger musicians often find difficulty in relating to an older style, Harper considers that it is left to some of them to be wiser than their predecessors. It's funny that it's the younger ones, but they've seen a lot of musicians die for nothing and with nothing and meaning nothing. Hakeem Jami, the bass player, considers that aiming for a collective rather than an individual goal can help to save an artist from the kind of self-destruction that has been so prevalent in the music. It gives them some hope, some daylight, you understand, and that is what cats need, some hope, a chance. Lee Morgan, who was active in both the J&PM and CBA, was a brilliant trumpeter closely associated with the hard bop style and known to jazz listeners everywhere through his work with his own groups and Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. He had joined the Dizzy Gillespie Big Band as an 18-year-old prodigy, and so even after 15 years in the music business, he was still a couple of years younger than people like Archie Shepp and Pharoah Sanders. When Shepp first arrived in Philadelphia, incidentally, it was the teenaged Morgan, already established in his hometown, who gave the saxophonist a helping hand. In common with the majority of contemporary black musicians, Morgan felt that the word jazz is frequently used to block the exposure given to the music. I think racism comes into this, he said, and pointed out that the efforts of musicians' collectives are influenced by the idea of a deliberate conspiracy to inhibit the music's progress. We know why, and we know the people in the media know why. So when they say you can't play this or you can't play that, we know this is hogwash because the public have very little to say about what they hear on the radio or what they see on TV. So what we are trying to do is to try to direct our communication directly to the people, our people. Leroy Jones's Black Arts Group presented the new music in the streets of Harlem in 1963 to 65, attracting an audience of people who left their houses out of curiosity at first and stayed out of interest. But one of the first positive attempts to take jazz back into the black community originally had less to do with collectivism and education than with advertising. I'm going to take a sip. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Tracy. I'm reading an article from early 70s by Valerie Wilmer about jazz, the media, and collectivism. This had originally less to do with collectivism and education than with advertising. The Jazzmobile, which started operations in 1964 and was the first of many mobile theater projects, was instigated by the Harlem Community Council. It is just what its name implies, a bandstand set up on the back of a truck. It was originally sponsored by Coca-Cola and Ballantine Beer, and for a nominal fee, musicians took their music each summer into Harlem the Bronx, Brooklyn, and other culturally deprived areas where many of the younger blacks had never heard jazz before. By 1971, the Jazzmobile was receiving grants from the New York State Council on the Arts and other bodies, and in 10 years, oh, maybe this was written in 1981. I take it back. A retrospective. And in 10 years, it has progressed from a summer season of 10 free concerts to a year-round program which also presents public school lecture concerts conducted by pianist Billy Taylor, as well as a weekly workshop clinic for aspiring young musicians held at IS 201, a Harlem school. Every Saturday, a staff of experienced musicians headed by the drummer David Bailey, now executive director of Jazzmobile, but famous for his work with Jerry Mulligan, conduct a series of sessions at the Jazzmobile Workshop for students whose ages range from 15 to 50, with a syllabus that includes everything from instrumental basics to big band orchestration. Dizzy Gillespie lectures there whenever he is in town, and among the others are trumpeter Joe Newman, trombonist Curtis Fuller, saxophonists Jimmy Heath and Billy Mitchell, guitarist Ted Dunbar, bassist Richard Davis, and drummers Freddie Waits and Albert Tootie Heath. Lee Morgan was also a regular. The students, surrounded by the mandatory posters proclaiming the evils of narcotics, are impressively serious about their music. Jazz Interactions started a similar program in 1975 under the direction of Joe Newman. Both this and the Jazzmobile program are concerned more with conventional values than avant-garde experiment, but they are oases in a desert of musical trivia. With the exception of the bookstores and centers that are the strongholds of black nationalism, recordings of the new music are unobtainable in Harlem, and rarely is anything at all representative of the new music broadcast. Radio station WBLS, which calls itself the Black Experience in Sound, plays maybe one jazz record in 200, and then it is by an established record seller such as Donald Byrd or Eddie Harris. Even the selections of WRVR, a 22-hour jazz station, are relatively middle of the road. Although the majority of black songwriters pulled their heads out of the sand some time ago and took a political stance in their lyrics, we as a people are not interested in baby, baby songs anymore. There's more to life than that, says Stevie Wonder. The disc jockeys continue to be rock-oriented and ignorant about jazz. You can't depend on someone else making sure your music gets across, says Billy Harper. Musicians have to be concerned with it themselves. That there are few black promoters for the new music helps to maintain the musical status quo in the ghetto, something many consider to be linked with politics and economic power. The point is to keep the natives happy by giving them some music they can dance to and be just concerned with rhythm, says Harper. I think that if more of the contemporary black music was played, people would probably think a little more, and that may be a little dangerous for some people politically. 1981, I think this is what she's writing. If people in Harlem, for example, are just dancing to the radio all day and just being gone on that, they're not going to worry about any of the problems. If we had realized a long time ago that it was necessary to do our own thing, then we should have been promoting it ourselves. But even when I started in music, I didn't want to do anything but create music. That's what I'm here for, and that's what I was born for. But I have to be concerned with other things now. I'm still concerned with creating music, but I'm also concerned about the direction of it and how it's handled. Before, the musicians depended on the promoter to take care of that. Harper is one of the musicians who recognizes that there is an audience and a market for the new music that is not always accessible or catered to through conventional channels. I'm just going to take a pause here, take a sip, shelter in place story time. Welcome, Rose, Marilyn. The new music, that's a term, that was, it's an old term now, But in this period where jazz was very experimental and had a lot of political awareness in it in the 60s and on, and a lot of the artists coming out of the jazz tradition would even not want to use the term jazz. So there was a lot of the language to describe the music became part of the experiment itself, and which of course fed into these issues about the media and commodification of the music and the way you name it. So in the context of this article, she's using the term new music to as sort of this politically aware, experimental, non-commercial, improvisational music, which is coming out of the jazz tradition, but a lot of the performers didn't even want to use the term jazz. Just so you know, you're going, what is she talking about? But Google it, you'll see. Okay, meanwhile, Harper is one of the musicians who recognizes that there is an audience and a market for the new music that is not always accessible or catered to through conventional channels. There are always blacks who know about the music, but it's hard to get it to them. Some black people do not realize the importance of this music. They're being brainwashed with all that stuff that's on the radio. And that's a whole other discussion, but this is early 1980s. Some of the musicians in contemporary black music say on their horns that conditions are not right here. Not verbally, but sometimes it comes through that the situation is not right. But there really is a total brainwash. I certainly don't think that Archie Shepp could play at the Apollo. The people who go there are programmed for a certain kind of music, and that's all they can hear, that's all they can accept. To Billy Higgins, the drummer, it is the same story. If you keep telling somebody this is what's happening, they really begin to believe it. It's like computers. They have us programmed, whether we know it or not. You hear it in your sleep. You go to a club, and after the set is over, they turn the jukebox on. Young kids are talking about, yeah, this is it. They don't even know 3 notes. They get the bass and learn some blues, and this is it. Take somebody slick as Miles Davis. They wired him up with all that electricity and shit only because that's what the media demanded. The sound, that was the in sound, but that's what stops you from having leaders and innovators, you understand? I feel sorry for the young kids now. They don't have nothing to look forward to. I asked a little kid on my block, I said, "What's your favorite instrument?" He said he wanted to play bass, but he doesn't even know what a bass fiddle looks like. He's playing the Fender bass. I asked him about the upright bass, and he didn't even know what it was. Every place you go, they're telling you about soul music or rock and roll, but that shit is old. Black people have been doing that shit for 9 generations just to stop from being bored. They used it as a tool to stop from going crazy. That is Billy Higgins talking. Don Pullen, the pianist who has reached his widest audience through his work with Charles Mingus, says, "Everybody is not just a finger popper, and quite a few people dig the music. They have the records of many different artists, but when they go out, the tenor sax and organ groups are there, and that's what they are presented. If you give them a chance to come to concerts, to see somebody they'd like to see, they go and get their tickets. But you have to do it yourself, because not too many people want to take the chance. They don't think it will work." In the past, musicians practiced a bar camaraderie, but tended to be secretive about their work. They would keep news of their activities from each other, so that there was no chance of losing a personal contact in the employment field. This gigging mentality can be found today among musicians who lack the community spirit, but things are changing towards more collective thinking. Whenever Archie Shepp has a record date now, for example, he also drafts a number of stray musicians into the studio, some of whom are little known, some of whom have fallen on hard times. Sometimes their contribution to the music is useful. Often their part could just as easily have been played by a member of his regular band. The point is that the musician picks up a check for a session fee, though ultimately the money comes out of the leader's pocket and not the record company's profits, as it is the leader who bears all the expenses on a recording date. A similar situation occurred in Paris in 1969 when BYG recorded all the Americans assembled en route to play at the Amougy Jazz and Pop Festival held in Belgium. Sonny Murray, Clifford Thornton, and others added hordes of other musicians to their sessions, and Shep even included a couple of older musicians temporarily domiciled in Paris who, at the time, avowedly disliked most avant-garde music. This is just one way in which the music world has been aligning itself with what Milford Graves calls socialism. It is inspired by the recognition of the fact that in music, as in life, dividing the people weakens them and effectively lessens their contribution. This is not to imply that erstwhile bands were artistically weak, but there existed in jazz, and still does to a degree, very much a star versus sideman syndrome. And that's a good one. Star versus sideman syndrome. The ego thing, that's always been the problem with musicians, said Billy Harper. There's always been the separation so that musicians and other blacks have the thing about, I'm the greatest. This is number one and that is number two. And that's silly. You're number three, so don't speak to me. But what is this? Everybody here is trying to create music, you dig? And somebody's talking about, I had a hard time making it, so you make it the way you can, the usual type of thing. And that's the way it was when I got to New York. The spirit of competition has always been strong in the music and is spurred on by such quaint ideas as polls in which readers and or critics vote for their favorite performer. The winners are often thereafter identified as being the best. Sound familiar, Austin? On their instruments, an accolade that considerably helps their chances of employment in the subsequent months, especially in the recording field. It also leads to the possibility of the instrument companies asking them to endorse their products and being given a free instrument for doing so. There is also a system where critics award stars to the records they review, their number depending on the alleged merit of the performance. To Archie Shep, this reduces the artist to the status of a racehorse. I mean, did you ever see Rubinstein awarded stars for a performance? Bach wasn't no threat to Beethoven, and they're both great, right? Nobody says who gets 5 stars. It's a way of treating black culture which is discriminatory and divisive because it always creates competitiveness on the very jivest, lowest level. Quote from Archie Shep. Footnote, it is incidentally not only black musicians who feel this way. In the London Sunday Times in December 1973, the British writer John Berger explained his reason for giving 50% of his Booker Prize for Best Novel to the Black Panther Party. Quote, the whole emphasis on winners and losers is false and out of place in the context of literature, unquote. Not everyone feels this way, of course. Noah Howard said, when you're a child, if you're good, your mother gives you a cookie. The artist is no exception. When he receives an award, it makes him feel somebody out there appreciates what he's doing. I'd like a cookie. Anybody? Hey, Paul, how you doing? Monty, thanks for joining in. Shelter in Place Storytime. I'm reading this article by Valerie Wilmer. This is from an out-of-print book, but backwards. But there it is if you want to Google it. She's an interesting writer. Whether the competitiveness of the past hurt the music or was a necessary part of its history is debatable. As the musicians began to recognize the destructiveness of superimposed orders of merit, a number of groups adopted a cooperative policy. There had been cooperatives in the past. The modern jazz quartet is an obvious example. But in the new music, one of the first was Music Incorporated, a quartet co-led originally by trumpeter Charles Tolliver and pianist Stanley Cowell. Others based in New York include Abdullah, the Melodic Artet, Abdullah, the Melodic Artet, the Aboriginal Music Society, and the Revolutionary Ensemble. In Chicago, there are the many units from the AACM, among them the Third World, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, Air and the Light. St. Louis Black Artists Group had a membership of between 25 to 30 musicians at one time, as well as singers, poets, dancers, and visual artists. BAG and the Human Arts Association nurtured groups like the Solidarity Unit and Children of the Sun. Sadly, BAG exists now only on a spiritual level. Its members continue to work together and exchange ideas, but the demise of the group was hastened by the collapse of their funding program, which coincided with the departure for Europe of their 5 leading members. Unlike AACM, the younger members proved insufficiently mature to carry on the aims of BAG. Leroy Jenkins, violinist with a revolutionary ensemble, explained that cooperatives were often formed to dispose of the sideman image. It takes a lot of the load off you. A leader has a lot of extra work, and the other guys sit back and get all the benefits of his work. The leader also becomes a father complex, and a lot of leaders just don't want to be a father. I want to be a leader. We're opening up a lot of avenues for cats, said Ciron, the group's bassist. I feel that if we can build up this rapport within ourselves to be wholly dependent on ourselves, then we really don't need anybody else. It's a simple matter. Guys got to think first of all that the music is everything, and from the music, everything else happens. In the past, the average musician who sought to make it would welcome personal publicity. Now it is common for some groups to insist on being interviewed only as a unit. If they share responsibility for decisions about the music and where and how it should be presented, so they want to exercise some control over what appears in print. And some artists refuse to be interviewed at all. Somebody admired my shirt. Thank you. A few have been so discouraged by their failure to find employment that, faced with the success gained by others apparently through personal publicity in the jazz press, they insist on payments in exchange for an interview. They are roundly condemned for this attitude by trumpeter-trombonist Clifford Thornton. To Thornton, these musicians are the same people who, when offered a job or a recording date, quote a price so high that the offer has to be withdrawn. I know some cats around here, they're always crying in their beer saying, they never talk about me in the magazines, so there must be a great conspiracy. Some mythological they is really at work to block my shit, right? But at the same time, when somebody comes along who is maybe in a position to shed some light on their situation, or is just curious about them, they will say, well, how much money you got in your pocket? They are like so important and so crucial to life's going on, or to the sun rising tomorrow, that in order for you to approach them, you've got to pay them. I mean, now isn't that ridiculous? This type doesn't understand that his enemy is not the person who is trying to write, because that's an important function in the sense that it communicates. His enemies might be the publisher, but he can't even relate to the writer as an artist. Nobody has talent but him, and nobody's important but him. These are strange attitudes. They have to be called counter-revolutionary, because no change is going to be effected if we walk around with shit like that in our heads. Not everyone is confident that cooperatives are the answer to the problems facing the creative artist involved in black music. Ted Daniel feels that their popularity depends on the economic situation of the members. If, for some reason, a whole lot of money gets poured into their colony, I think maybe the collective hit would disintegrate. Not necessarily, but I think people would tend to approach the music much more or less as individuals. What did Blakey say? The group that stays together plays together. That's so true. We come and go so fast, man, especially in New York. You play with one group this time, and next time the group hits, there's 15 other cats in the band, and you don't get a chance to establish a rapport and a really good band sound. You get good music, but take a band like Trains. That was a unique sound. That was a band that had been established over a period of years. Lee Morgan and Billy Higgins came out of the star syndrome. Both were voted new star on their instruments in Downbeat. But through the doctrine of collectivism, their political attitudes were changed in varying degrees. Higgins outlined what he saw as the benefits of a cooperative. With a band that is not so much a leader band, but where you can get some cats that are cool enough so that everybody can make some money, each individual feels more like putting out. The modern jazz quartet has been very beautiful for the reason that everybody has been able to cash in on it. Those cats have got homes. they've been able to make a nice living, plus play together. If there would be more of that, I know that it would be really beautiful. I know I made records with this cat and that cat and played with this cat and that cat. Cats get famous and make money out of this and money out of that. You're a sideman and you don't get nothing. A lot of times you're not even given the recognition. But that's the way the business is, and it really makes people go around feeling like they're stars. To Hakim Jami, it depends on the individual as to whether he would be satisfied with making a contribution to the music while remaining an unknown, though, as he pointed out, there is strong economic pressure connected with recognition. I don't care if nobody don't know me, as long as I'm comfortable in doing what I want to do. I'm straight once I reach that point. I'm not saying I've reached that now because, you dig, I'm living on a 5th floor walk-up, but I guess when you think in terms of how much money you can demand, you got to have a certain amount of recognition, because if you don't have it, people won't pay you any money to play. It's the who are you scene. So it ain't so much the cat wanting per se recognition, but in terms of business, it's sometimes a necessity to have a certain amount of publicity. It's a business. This is the whole thing that sometimes keeps the musicians held back. The businessmen are doing the thing so they can get the money, and a lot of the time they give the recognition to who they want to. How we doing? It's 9 o'clock. Oh, we're almost done. Hope everybody's having a good time. Mark, David. In this edition of Shelter in Place Storytime, during this week of protests and marches all around the country, I thought I'd dip into a little cultural history, and this is an article by Valerie Wilmer about collectivism and sort of radical thought within the black music tradition. This is 1960s, 70s, and anyway, continuing on. Andrew Cyril is proud of the fact that he has managed to make a living out of music alone. He recognizes the need for a certain kind of personal organization. I just try to keep my head leveled and my nose clean and walk the straight and narrow, just as he recognizes that it is necessary for black musicians to think collectively about their own culture, because whites will always, on the whole, identify with other whites. He puts the blame at the doors of the black community as a whole, not just the musicians. One solution Cyril envisages would be for the community to encourage their artists in residence to express their music and help provide the means whereby they can make an adequate living. It's still the case that black people produce and white people package. We are more or less like a race of consumer employees. Now, because there seems to be a more concerted move towards education in this generation and the next, maybe cats will begin to think about business, to think about opening collective shops or producing records. It's the same thing with writers. We have writers, but we don't have any black publishing companies. And you don't even have black people selling musical instruments, really. This is written 1981, I think. Traditionally, the musician has always waited for the phone to ring. He always knew that the audience was there. That was not the problem. It was the promoters who had to be convinced. It was a tiring system, and eventually they started to realize that the only way they could control the situation was by organizing their own activities. Max Roach and Randy Weston had had limited success with the musicians' organization back in the 50s, but with the Jazz Composers Guild, Bill Dixon had shown that it was possible for even the most anarchistic to come together and work for a mutual goal. During the 1960s, sessions held in lofts owned by musicians, painters, and others were common. The audiences were small and very little money was involved, but the new music was being propagated. I know at that period everybody felt as though something new was forming, said Milford Graves. It was like a revolution in the music, and people felt, well, a lot of people won't understand what we're doing. Voters won't help us, or record companies. We're trying to get a listening audience. Gradually, too, the far-sighted musicians began hiring halls and putting on their own concerts. Judson, later Kami Hall, across the street from Carnegie Hall, was a popular venue. Few musicians were in a position to turn down gigs, but by preference they had become less interested in working in clubs. Clubs have the atmosphere of a gig, Cerrone voiced an opinion shared by many. Not when ornette plays a club, nor when John played. You'd go there each night, but each night was different. But 6 nights a week, that's slave trade. That's like putting some kind of helmet on your head and screwing it on as tight as you possibly can and saying, now play beautiful music. I got to read that sentence again. 6 nights a week. That's like putting some kind of helmet on your head and screwing it on as tight as you possibly can and saying, now play beautiful music. In 1972, George Wein moved the Newport Jazz Festival to New York and received so much press coverage about the profit he was or was not making that one sometimes wondered where the actual creative artists came into the picture. The Newport Festival was supposed to be a medium for all the talent in New York, but some of them really were relics. The music was misrepresented, and it's insulting, in a sense, that they would decide what music to present and what to ignore. Sam Rivers, tenor saxophonist, professor in the African American Music Department at Connecticut's Wesleyan University, late of the Cecil Taylor Group, and veteran of many other name bands, among them Miles Davis, was one of the prime movers in organizing the Counter Festival that ran concurrently with Ween's. The abundance of talent in New York as far as musicians are concerned is almost inexhaustible. To have the situation narrowed down to a few names is good for the businessman because in that way he has the greater his control. And actually, those musicians who appeared at the festival aren't all as good as the other musicians who aren't exposed. The main workhorses and catalysts for the first New York Musicians Festival were trumpeter James Dubois, director of Studio We, a musicians' cooperative venture, and Juma Sultan, a conga drummer who once worked with Jimi Hendrix's Band of Gypsies and is the driving force behind the Aboriginal Music Society, a band that originally used only non-Western and handmade instruments. Rivers was living in a loft near the Bowery and opened it as one of the festival locations and gave it the name of Studio Rivby. Later, Rivers received a grant from the New York State Council on the Arts, which has enabled him to present concerts and workshops nightly at the loft. The point of the Counter Festival was not to compete with Ween on a commercial level, but to take advantage of the presence of visitors in town, many of them from overseas, and expose the music. I'm having some kind of a South by Southwest unofficial showcase deja vu, but that's another story. Meanwhile, nevertheless, I've got to interrupt. Monty Newton. I keep thinking of Miles Davis's various bands and ensembles, 1950 to 1985. Well, that's good you're thinking of that. Yeah, there's a lot in here. There's a lot. And I'm reading this article just, it's a historical document, and these are quotes and interviews with various musicians with various attitudes. And I think it's all about the discourse and this discussion and exchange of ideas. And so basically, I'm bringing it to the table tonight in this week of a lot of demonstrations about our history, just to bring up our history of political discourse that's expressed in different cultural ways. And so, of course, jazz is such a strong part of our tradition, and the politics of particular times, particular periods in our history get expressed by the musicians, but through the music. And so that's why I thought it was interesting. I hope so. All right, the denouement. Here we go. Nevertheless, the urgent need for even more concentrated collective action was made abundantly clear in 1974 when the young musicians who had relied to a great degree on their continuing summertime employment in the New York parks found themselves abruptly back in the streets. Displaying none of the magnanimity of the previous year when he had provided a series of token concerts featuring the younger musicians, Ween managed to divert the financing of the Parks Department and the New York State Council on the Arts and apply it to his own program. The difference was that at his al fresco concerts, only established artists were heard. For the most part, the formal Newport bill continued to groan under the weight of elderly performers and such jazz artists as Diana Ross and Johnny Mathis. It is hardly surprising that there has been a decline in the practice of playing together for the music's sake alone. These are some musicians who are always, there are some musicians who are always ready to play just for enjoyment, but for the majority, as they have seen their financial situation worsen in the face of the current economic crisis, they have also seen that of their commercially oriented they have seen that of their commercially oriented counterpart improve. As their situation got worse, the commercially oriented performers get better. They get the gigs. Understandably, their enthusiasm for the music is tempered with bitterness. In the loft days, it was different. Artists were concentrating on getting an idea across and not thinking of money. A lot of people stayed in with that particular movement in music, and a lot have dropped out, said Milford Graves. And the people that stayed in, they feel as though they have established themselves musically, that they have made their statements, and there's no more going out just for exposure. It's really survival now. The majority of musicians, though, are optimistic about the future in spite of the economic setbacks. Whatever the employment situation, said Andrew Cyril, people are just going to be creative, even if they have to get out on the streets like they used to do back in the washboard days. You just make the adjustment on how or where you are going to play. Well, from Valerie Wilmer, As Serious as Your Life, music journalism, talking about the 1960s and 70s. Thanks for watching, David. Good to see you. And what should I say in conclusion? I don't know how many people are following the news closely and how many are saying it's too much. I'm just going to have to put the opaque setting on my bubble and just hunker down. But I think that as far as those of us who are involved in producing culture, I don't like using that word, but doing stuff that's culturally based, and we're trying to help channel our emotions and the issues we're dealing with through our art, reading and looking back on history and seeing what previous generations were doing and how they expressed their frustrations or their creative insights and tried new things. I think it's helpful, it's useful. And so I guess maybe here's a challenge. I'll lay down a challenge as your self-appointed beatnik in residence. This spirit of collectivism, of we can't do things individually, or we can, but we're much more effective if we work together and do things together. And, how can we do that in this period where, for health reasons, we're trying to stay separate? That's a real challenge. And I see one thing going on, which is because so much is online and sharing things through online broadcasts and producing videos and audio content and all these different softwares and apps and things, and people saying, how do you do this? How do you do that? What microphone should I use? Acapella, Jamkazam, Zoom, Skype, all that. Sharing information. It's more than just, being helpful to each other. It's we can raise the cultural literacy, what we have to work with now with all this online technology. That's going to be kind of our literacy or our currency for a while. And so if we help each other to all be able to use that and then participate in society through this technology more easily, I think that's important. I don't know if we'll all end up becoming androids at the end of this, but I appreciate that. I really don't like having to learn all this technology. I want to just play my instrument, but that's what we got to do. So I appreciate input. I appreciate what they're doing and watching what they're doing, and we learn from each other. I hope that my story time is nice for you on Sunday, if it adds a little bit. And it just helps me mark my week. So this has been Sunday, and now on into Monday. Please stay in touch. pksaxhq@gmail.com, my email. pksax.com, my website. Facebook, P. Klemperer. Venmo, whatever that's, Paul Dash Klemperer, yada yada. And oh, thanks. Getting some hearts and flowers from around the world, around the country. Back at you. And okay, Zoom Jazz Workshop on Tuesday. If you'd like to participate, it's free, or I'm not charging unless you want to donate something. But just send me an email. Once again, pksaxhq@gmail.com if you'd like to be part of the workshop. And then, of course, Space Force Jazz Lounge every Wednesday. And now I have a date with Netflix because the Space Force with Steve Carell is now available. So I've got to do my research. So work.